Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to the Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So the United States has been pulling its troops out of Afghanistan with the goal of being completely out by the end of August. And since Joe Biden announced that this was happening back in April, the security situation's deteriorated very quickly.
Kandahar is one of the many provinces to see a recent surge in offensives by the Taliban. The group have been emboldened as US-led Western forces near a complete withdrawal from the country after nearly 20 years of fighting.
The Taliban have been gaining more and more ground and closing in on the capital, Kabul. They now claim to be in control of 85% of the country. Peace talks between them and the Afghan government have stalled, and there's fear that it's only a matter of time before a total Taliban takeover, or that once foreign forces are gone, Afghanistan will spiral even deeper into civil war. Refugees and Afghan security personnel have been fleeing into Iran and Tajikistan. But one group is asking for Canada's help: Afghan nationals who used to work for the Canadian government, drivers and interpreters, and people who supported Canada's troops before we pulled out 7 years ago, and people who've been supporting Canada's embassy since then. They say they're afraid for their lives, and the Canadian government isn't doing enough to help them.
In some cases, some of these people worked for the Canadian government for over a decade, and it's because they worked for Canada that they find themselves in this precarious position, and now they're feeling that they have no help at all.
Janice Dickson is a reporter for the Globe's Ottawa Bureau, and she's been speaking to some of these people. She's on the show today, and we're going to talk about the dangers these Afghan civilians are facing and what's at stake if they don't manage to get out. You're listening to The Decibel. Hi, Janice.
Hi, Tamara.
It's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here.
I'm talking to you on Thursday morning, and you've been talking to Afghan nationals who used to work for the Canadian government. And I wanted to ask you about one person that I read about in your reporting, and his name is Abdul Qayyum Himmat. Can you tell me about him?
Yeah, so Abdul reached out to me last week saying that he represents 11 drivers, including himself, who worked for the Canadian embassy for years. You know, he worked for 13 years, but he said his colleagues worked from anywhere from 10 to 15 years. I called him in Kabul, and he talked about how they drove embassy staff, anyone who needed a drive, whether it was RCMP members of the military, to restaurants, embassies, the airport, military bases, hotels, to markets around Kabul. And that they were replaced in 2020, so last fall, by a security company that also provided close protection. So these drivers, Abdul and his colleagues, were not armed, and they were replaced by a security company that could provide that kind of level of protection. So Abdul reached out to me because he said that now that the U.S. Is quickly, in its final stages of pulling its troops out of the country, and as the Taliban gains ground, they are extremely worried because they worked for Western governments that they will be the first targets for the Taliban.
Right. So Abdul's a driver, but there are also Afghan nationals who worked for the Canadian government in other capacities. And I know Canadian troops pulled out of Afghanistan 7 years ago. And I'm just wondering in what capacity Afghans have been helping the Canadian government since the troops pulled out.
So I heard from a former senior officer who worked for the embassy for over 8 years, and he was very cautious. He does not want his identity to be revealed in any way, but said that he worked very closely with the ambassador, the deputy ambassador, and that there are other officers who served in political and, development roles and who also helped support Canadian projects. A lot of coverage that I've seen and that I've heard about from the drivers and the other staff is that it's really focused on interpreters who did play a crucial role serving alongside Canadian Armed Forces. But after the forces left, as you mentioned, Afghans continued to help the Canadian embassy in, positions related to trade, political staff, diplomatic staff, drivers, as I mentioned. So there were a number of Afghans who supported our mission there and continue to, and that still do today.
So just supporting Canada's presence in the country. And now these people are asking the government to help them relocate and they want to move to Canada.
Exactly. And so what the former employees have heard is that the Canadian government and the embassy in particular are working to help current staff that are there, but that they haven't heard anything and that they're reaching out to the embassy and to their former contacts saying, we're facing threats, we need out too. And they're not getting any kind of responses back, or they're getting sort of blanket responses that indicate, how to seek refugee protection in Canada. And a lot of that criteria is extremely difficult. I mean, for one, it means actually leaving the country, which they can't do. It's too dangerous. So they're looking for a special program where they can submit information saying their role with the embassy, their work, the commitment that they had for so long, and why they need out. I asked the Immigration Minister's office specifically about the drivers who are seeking Canada's assistance. And Alexander Cohen, who's a spokesperson for the minister, said that they do not comment on specific operational matters of Canada's missions abroad, but that Ottawa is working to assist some individuals previously or currently employed by the Canadian government in Afghanistan who wish to come here. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was asked about this issue, but he was asked specifically about Afghan interpreters, and he said his ministers are working on it.
What exactly are your sources, these Afghan nationals who used to work for the Canadian government? What are they afraid of?
Okay, so one of the drivers who I talked to earlier this week told me that his brother was killed outside of his home because insurgents had shown up to his door, to the driver's door, and his brother felt that, these individuals are coming to target my brother because of his connection to the embassy. So his brother went outside and he was shot. And so after that, he has installed video surveillance all outside of his home. And he said that he and his children rotate all hours of the day and the night, and that they really can't leave, that their movement is very limited. And that is something that I heard also from the former senior official who worked in the embassy, is that their movement is just so limited, like they're terrified to leave their homes. And that individual has also received direct phone threats and also threats through distant relatives, asking about why he worked for a Western government and that sort of thing.
How would you explain what has changed now on the ground? Like, why is there this sudden urgency for people to relocate to Canada?
So the urgency is fueled by the fact that the U.S. is withdrawing its troops and that there will no longer be a NATO presence in the country. Human Rights Watch issued a report over a month ago now urging countries that have had Afghan employees assist their governments extricate them, as quickly as possible because of the danger of Taliban reprisals that they face.
Could you describe the tone of your conversations with Abdul? Like, how does he sound when you talk to him?
When I talked to him on the phone the first time, I could hear his kids in the background and, they were laughing. And he said he looks at his kids and he wonders what will happen to them if he's not alive. His daughter is 5 years old and his son is 3. He sent me photos of them this morning of his son playing a game on his cell phone and his daughter's, wearing a yellow dress and she's sitting beside him watching him play a game like it's a typical scene you would see of kids anywhere. And, he's desperate to get his family out of the country. And I think that it's important for our listeners to know that nobody wants to leave home either. And definitely no one wants to be forced to leave their homes. And so I guess that's something I would want people to think about.
I mean, the other thing that stuck out to me was that these people have been working for, like they had been working for the government for 10, 15 years in some cases, right? Like this wasn't just one short little contract and them doing a quick favor for the government. Like these people have relationships with Canadians who are on the ground in Canada. So, I mean, do they feel betrayed?
Yeah, and I think that's also what really brought this issue home for me is when Abdul was sharing photos of himself inside the embassy wearing Canada 150, birthday celebration T-shirts. Mm-hmm. He and a few other guys, one was in a red shirt, the other was in white, and then red and white, and so on. Mm-hmm. And they're smiling, and, there was another photo of them outside on a court, and it was sort of like a big group photo under a big Canada 150 banner, and they're holding hockey sticks, and it feels like, you're literally transported into a different time when he thought, he had a great position with the Canadian government and everything was feeling very hopeful. And, that's another thing that he said is that if he came to Canada, he could live here very easily. He knows everything about Canada. He has Canadian friends. And that's something that the other employees said as well. They feel like they have deep ties to Canada because of their work.
Have the Taliban actually said that former employees of foreign governments would be targeted?
So Human Rights Watch said that the Taliban denied that former employees and interpreters who worked for foreign governments were at risk. But the Taliban also warned that these individuals should show remorse for their past actions and not engage in activities that amount to treason against Islam in the country. The drivers and the former staff are extremely fearful of the Taliban.
Mm-hmm. So how many of these people who used to work for the Canadian government are actually now hoping to move to Canada?
So when I first started looking into this story and I was asking the Canadian government, what are you doing to help former staff come here? And do you have a sense of how many there are? One source told me that there are about 40, mostly former interpreters who are seeking to come to Canada. They've indicated they want to come here. And in addition, 2 Afghan employees at the embassy, which they did not provide a number for. However, clearly the people who I've talked to are not included in these figures. We've got 11 drivers, their family members, mm-hmm. and the senior officer who worked at the embassy said he knows of many other officers who served in a similar position as he did.
Right. So the federal government says that there are 40 people, mostly interpreters, who want to come over, but that number is probably higher.
That's right. And they also said that they are expecting to hear from more, but they also said that the reason why they're not implementing a big special program like they had previously for former staff is because the number is low at this point. But they weren't closing the door on a program entirely, but they felt that they could deal with these cases individually because they were dealing with 40 or maybe over 40 people.
There were 2 versions of a resettlement program for Afghan nationals before, right? Can you tell me about those and what happened to them?
Yeah, so in 2009, the former Conservative government had a special immigration measures program for certain Afghans who served as local staff in Kandahar or on a contract that supported the Canadian government. So I looked at the policy announcement from 2009, and it said in general that applicants had to demonstrate that they face individualized and extraordinary risk or suffered from a serious injury as a result of their work with the Canadian government. They also must have worked for a full year in Kandahar in support of the Canadian mission. So this is very specific criteria. In February 2012, the Immigration Department began implementing a revised policy to help more people whose cases perhaps were not successful under the first policy. In addition to these programs, Afghans who were not eligible can still apply to immigrate to Canada through, the existing measures in the Immigration Act. And they can apply also through humanitarian and compassionate consideration. But I think it's important to keep in mind, because I asked Abdul this question, did you try and come to Canada before? Mm-hmm. He said his understanding is that the program, as I just described it, was for people who assisted the Canadian Armed Forces and the Canadian government, specifically in Kandahar. So he said that embassy staff were not included. He also said that at the time, Kabul was safe and he was feeling really hopeful for the future. So there was sort of no pressure, I guess, to try and come here at that time.
What are your sources saying about how this process is going? Is it moving quickly enough? Because it kind of seems like time is of the essence here.
Yeah, no, and that is what they say, that time is of the essence. And at this point, there's no process for them. They're feeling that, Canada is known as a country that's very welcoming to refugees and immigrants around the world. It has a really good reputation for that. And so they're shocked that they are being ignored and that they had actually devoted, in some cases, some of these people worked for the Canadian government for over a decade. And it's because they worked for Canada that they find themselves in this precarious position. And now they're feeling that they have no help at all.
Yeah. And how does Canada's approach to this compare to other countries that participated in the war and had Afghans working for them? How have other countries been handling this?
So one of the first headlines that caught my eye on this issue is one that said that Germany had issued so far over 2,000 visas for former Afghan employees that helped its government. I understand that the U.S. has a robust program to help former employees of its government. And these former employees of the Canadian government, of course, have friends that worked for other countries. And they're hearing stories anecdotally that their friends are getting out of Afghanistan and they're wondering why Canada is dragging its heels.
So if you had to summarize it, what do you think are the stakes here if Canada doesn't act quickly enough?
Well, these former employees of the Canadian government have all said that they're very fearful that they will be killed if they do not come to Canada. So I don't think the stakes can get much higher than a life or death scenario.
What kind of message do you think Canada's sending to these former employees and people who work at embassies everywhere by not having a special program for their relocation under the circumstances?
I think it sends a message that the government doesn't care about them and doesn't value the work that they did for them. And I mean, I can't help but think that this message wouldn't resonate with local staff that are at other embassies. What if something happens to you? Will your employer, or what if something happens to you, your situation, your country, will Canada help you? And I think these employees felt very comfortable and very safe working for Canada and are, as I said, very shocked that they're not being helped, when they need help right now.
All right, Janice, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
So the day after we recorded this episode, Janice got an interview with Immigration Minister Marco Mendicino, who told her the government is working on a policy to let Afghan employees come to Canada. He said it would focus on interpreters, Afghan employees at the embassy, and their families. When Janice asked him about whether it would include former employees like Abdul Qayyum Hamad, the minister said they weren't ruling it out, and they were trying to be as inclusive as possible. Later that day, Janice talked to Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan, and he said that former employees who worked for us will be included, but there were no details on exactly how the policy would work or when it would be launched. All right, that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandakar. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Janice Dickson. You can find her on Twitter at Janice Dickson. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.